Right, I think we are live. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm Jen Schonger from the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, which is funded in part by the New Jersey Governor's Council for the Medical Research and Treatments in Autism and the New Jersey Department of Health. I am here today with one of my favorite humans, Dr. Mona Delahooke, who's a clinical child psychologist with a passion for supporting families and children. She's worked widely with multidisciplinary teams in the area of developmental and emotional differences for over 30 years. She's a senior faculty member of the Perfectum Foundation and is a trainer and consultant to schools, public and private agencies, and parents. Her blog and new book, Beyond Behaviors, which I can't say enough good things about, explores how we can use neuroscience and compassion to better understand and solve children's behavioral challenges. In today's talk, Dr. Delahooke will discuss the differences we observe in autism. She'll introduce a paradigm that helps us respect behaviors as signals coming from sensory processing differences and to respect behaviors for what they tell us about each individual and the supports they need. This approach to autism support stands in contrast to approaches that involve cajoling, reinforcing, and non-reinforcing of surface behaviors. Um, Speaking of Dr. Delahooke's new book, Beyond Behaviors, which I have right here.
Oh, wow.
She was generous enough to donate some books to us that we'll be able to give away after the presentation airs, and we're so thankful to you for that. I just wanted to mention a few brief housekeeping notes. If anyone would like to ask a question, and which we highly encourage, we hope you will, you just have to be logged into your YouTube account in order to post in the chat. We'll monitor the chat throughout, and we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. And this session will be available to watch at any time. You don't have to be logged in to watch. It will stay on our YouTube page, and Dr. Delahooke will likely share it as well. Dr. Delahooke, thank you so much for being here today. I'm
Yeah.
so excited. So I'm going to go off camera now, and I'll be back on for us to chat after.
Great. I will share my screen. Thank you so much for such a beautiful welcome.
Thank you.
Jen, I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so
Thrilled
much.
to be talking to everybody today. So here we go. It's just a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, and that's supporting children with neurodivergent minds and brains, and all of our children who have challenges, and particularly with behavioral challenges. So it's really a joy to be here. Now I am just on my, there we go. What we are going to be talking about is how we can learn to redefine our support for children, and particularly children who struggle with behavioral challenges, but also developmental differences, delays, and children who don't fit into what we might typically think of in terms of how we want them to act, and how we and our expectations in general. So one way to think about what we see in children's behaviors is what I call a developmental iceberg. And in an iceberg, as you know, in an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is only about 10% of that big chunk of ice. And it's those behaviors that we see. So we will see a child doing something, but the triggers, the causes, the reasons for those behaviors are really invisible. And that would be that large piece under the surface of the water that would contain the reasons. And there are millions of reasons that cause the behaviors that we see, that cause the things children say, that things they do, the way they move their bodies. And one of the main drivers of human behaviors, not just child behaviors, but of human behaviors, is our state, our physiological state. What is a physiological state? That basically is our brain body connection. You know, we have a nervous system, we have a central nervous system and an autonomic nervous system that connects our brain to our body and our body to our brain. So we're constantly getting feedback from our body that tells our brain what's going on. And then our brain kind of integrates all the information that's constantly coming in and then produces an action. And that's what we see in our children. So when we think about um, behaviors and how often behaviors are the focus of our attention, our treatment, our goals, particularly for children diagnosed on the autism spectrum, it brings up an interesting question. And that is, should we really be focusing on the behaviors or should we be focusing on something else? So, my work and what I have been doing in the last several decades since I was trained in a larger mind body paradigm. I actually was very fortunate to work with Dr. Stanley Greenspan and Dr. Serena Wieder many years ago when they were developing a developmental, essentially what turns out to be a neurodevelopmental approach to helping children with developmental differences, including autism. And when we studied, when we learned from across disciplines, we learned from pediatricians and occupational therapists, physical therapists, nurses, educators, um, vision therapists, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, in these really rich cross disciplinary teams, it forced essentially a lens shift, a paradigm shift that for me and for many of my colleagues made us realize that it's important to not just focus on a child's behavior because that's really only a signal. And so when we shift the lens, we can look at all these different things that are what we call individual differences. And individual differences in each of us, in every single human, is what drives our autonomic nervous system to notice things in the environment and to create all of our behaviors, but especially those behaviors that we might think about as challenging, as non preferred, and those behaviors that we want to oftentimes target for children to change. So, one concept I just wanted to bring up is the concept that vulnerability, that is, sensitivity to threat in the nervous system for children on the spectrum and for many, many children, is due to this sense of threat, this sense of not feeling comfortable in my brain and body. And so, oftentimes, what we see, therefore, is a behavioral challenge. Now, currently, oftentimes, like I said, we classify behaviors as compliant or non-compliant, as preferred or non-preferred, and this leads to uh, a paradigm of rewards and consequences, taking an action to teach a child about a behavior and encouraging certain behaviors over others. So it's kind of a bifurcated look at behaviors as either good or bad, compliant or non-compliant. Now, this shift that I propose in Beyond Behaviors is that we look at behaviors as an adaptation to a child's autonomic nervous system. And basically, what does that mean? It means that we can view behaviors, especially the ones that are persistent, the ones that are useful for the child and come up a lot, as cues as to their internal world, to their invisible needs. Those invisible needs could include feeling uncomfortable or pain inside the body, which is known as the interoception, what we feel inside of our bodies, but sensations, thoughts, emotions. and really moving away from compliant or non-compliant classifications, and especially not to willful misbehavior or behaviors that are there to serve a purpose um, that is considered negative. So, in my opinion, that's why our current go-tos are often wrong. Sometimes we blame the child. We can blame a diagnosis. We can say, oh, this behavior is part of the autism diagnosis. But oftentimes in the school systems where I am observing and working with children, it's not looked at as something positive. So an autistic behavior may be targeted for change if it's not if it's considered something that is in the category of being changed, graphed out for the volume, the number, the frequency of these behaviors. Sometimes, for other reasons, children's parents are accused of not being consistent enough or not doing something enough in the home. And I feel like there's a lot of blame that goes on that's inaccurate because we don't value behaviors for what they tell us. So what happens? Then we often go to time outs, positive and negative reinforcement schedules, or we blame a child's will. And we say things like the child is doing this behavior because they're trying to get negative attention. And these are the concepts that I think are being replaced with another understanding. And that is that individuals with differences, and particularly children on the spectrum with brain wiring differences, can have emotion regulation challenges, meaning that ability to stay calm in your body is impacted by reasons underneath the tip of the iceberg. Every single child, every single teenager, adult is different in terms of their wiring differences. But we do know that there is a tendency to have overreactivity in some of the sensory systems. So there are differences in some of the sensory systems that create the need for these adaptive behaviors. And which means that many behaviors, particularly repetitive behaviors, can serve an important purpose. They are protective, they're adaptive, and if they involve movement, we know that moving, whether that's saying something by moving your mouth or moving your general body and doing things, can help uh, humans feel better. So when we are struggling, when we're feeling uncomfortable, movement can help. But what happens oftentimes in our educational settings is that these various forms of movement are judged or viewed negatively or targeted for change. And so I would like to offer an idea, and that is one question that we can ask that's really important is this a behavior that is purposeful, that is willful, that is malicious, that is done with the child's intent, which would be what we would consider a top-down behavior. Top-down behaviors are planned, they serve a purpose, and they are that you have to have a certain level of executive function, essentially, this ability to plan and to consider consequences when you have these top-down behaviors. The second category of behaviors that are not differentiated from top-down behaviors would be considered bottom-up or body-up behaviors. These behaviors are ones we would consider stress responses or stress reactions or even stress behaviors, as Stuart Shanker calls them. And what we want to ask is this child experiencing a stress response? Is this a type of behavior that we should be focusing on at all? Or is it something that we should be looking at in terms of immediately going to help the child feel safer and feel emotionally co-regulated through our interactions? So let me read you just a little story about Max. This was not his real name, of course, and the details are shifted to protect identity. But this is a story that I see often in the work I do when compliance is pushed over emotional regulation. So I'll read it really quick. It was almost dinner time, and little Max, age 5, who was diagnosed with autism spectrum, was tired and hungry. After a busy and active afternoon, he was in the midst of a lengthy home session with his therapist when his mother stepped in the door from work. Smiling with delight, the boy instinctively ran towards the door to offer a greeting, only to have the behavior specialist instruct him to sit down and finish his task. The therapist stood in the way, blocking him and encouraging him to return to the table. Frustrated, Max burst into tears, screaming and striking the behavior therapist in protest. It took him several hours to calm down again. So, what was happening? The therapist, who was undoubtedly well intentioned, was focusing on behavioral goals without regard for the child's what we call social and emotional functioning, their sense of safety in their body, which determines our physiological state. Remember, that state of our body that is either calm or amped up and ready to run, also known as the fight or flight response. And in the behavioral paradigm, the intention was for the child to learn that it's important to finish a task before you go on to something else. And it was important to learn for the child to learn at this point that there were rules and that they would be able to do what they wanted once they finished the task. What they were focusing on was compliance, essentially, for what we would consider a non-preferred task, and a focus on the behavior rather than an inherent focus on relationships, and especially safety in relationships. One of the things that I've learned through my studies, and particularly from studying the polyvagal theory of Dr. Stephen Porges, is that safety in treatment sets a neurodevelopmental foundation. Essentially, feeling safe in your brain and your body is that really solid foundation that children need in order to be able to take new things in and stretch and learn new things and take risks. Essentially, this builds resilience in all children and humans. When you feel safe, you can take more risks. So what that point was kind of that point sometimes gets lost. And I believe that is because our education system is working from an outdated model, essentially, that views behaviors in isolation of the child's body, mind, and their relationships. And yeah, that's what's got to change, because we know that a child is more than their behaviors, A, and B. When the behavior is serving a purpose, we want to hear that purpose, see that purpose, have compassion for that which the child cannot say in words. The body is saying it, but the child can't say it in words. When the child is suffering, when the child has a stress response, when the child needs to move, like little Max did, and he was compelled out of joy and out of the lack of self-control, which is still developing, to hug his mama and to run into her arms. That was way more important, that safety, than having him learn the rule of sitting and finishing a task first, in my opinion. So it's kind of like the old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything isn't compliance or non-compliance. And this is the point that we need to understand, in my opinion, that we can use the information about a child's sensory system, about a child's sensory preferences, and about especially their sensitivities. Because again, in autism, so much is being learned, but there are differences in reactivity to the world. And I believe, even though I'm not autistic, my teachers, my main teachers, are my autistic clients, um, many of whom now are young adults and teenagers who can tell me and who guide me as to what life is like in their own body. And again, there's no stereotyping because everybody has their own triggers, their own sensory processing profile, which I think is was one of the gifts, one of the main benefits of learning this DIR floor time approach that I did so long ago, that helped us really track these individual differences and treasure them and respect them as those drivers that we know contribute to what we see our child doing. So I'm also a big fan, in addition to the people I've mentioned before, of Elizabeth Torres, who is a researcher and a brilliant neuroscience researcher. And the work is, as a clinician, I understand some of the work, but I can translate from what I learned from her and from talking to her, is that these automatic behaviors in autism that she has studied always can be state regulators. That means that these automatic behaviors, which sometimes can look disruptive, are helping the child regulate their physiological state, their autonomic nervous system, and essentially feel better. So she says automatic behaviors are subconscious, survival based, and not designed by the child to be oppositional, test limits, or make teachers or other adults uncomfortable or upset. And then when we target these behaviors, when we target behaviors that are adaptive for elimination, for example, a child's need to move their body in a certain way, or a child who has to prove that they need to use their noise canceling headphones, and that their vocalizations, when they are overwhelmed by background noises bouncing off the walls, are something that they can't control. The student shouldn't have to prove to us that they're not volitional. This is where we're getting into the need to respect neurodivergent brains, neurodivergent development, and help children understand that they can trust their body's reactions, and we will help them. There are so many different occupations that can help children trust their body's reactions better, such as occupational therapists and physical therapists and vision therapists. So what we really want to look at is how we can help with attunement. Attunement is the ability to help a child feel seen and heard and safe. And before anything else, the groundwork across the neuroscience on resilience, across the neuroscience on attention, focus, what Dr. Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance, how we help children grow but don't overwhelm them, is making sure the child feels physically and emotionally safe through relationships. The science of relationships is so solid. And a website that I would recommend that was just so excellent is the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And Dr. Jack Shonkoff is a pediatrician, has written so much about this translational knowledge. What parents and pediatricians and teachers and therapists need to know about helping children feel safe through relationships. I have seen and been in so many classrooms where, again, well-meaning aides, behavior specialists, and those individuals who are there to support students have been instructed through their IEPs to not reinforce behaviors for children. And so oftentimes they're ignoring of the child and only waiting until the child does a certain type of behavior before they reward them with a kind look or a pat on the back. And this is what we need to change because it's conditional. It's based, again, think about that tip of the iceberg. We're following the wrong lead. We need to be following a deeper lead, a more holistic brain body perspective. And when we do, we can understand, is there a stress response going on? Is what we're asking of the student or of the child exceeding their ability to carry out the task in the moment? And maybe in the next moment or in the next hour or next day, they will have the proper support in their body and from their relationships to carry out that task. So in doing so, I would recommend that we're flexible about changing plans and treatment goals, and that we prioritize things like warmth, engagement, and understanding first, especially when we see children exhibiting these stress responses, these stress behaviors. So I have a worksheet in the book that is entitled "Behaviors Have Meaning," and here, if you have the book, you can see fill out these worksheets, and a teacher can fill it out. And this is the first question: is it possible that the child's behavior is meeting a constitutional need? That is a need in their body. Does the child need to engage in the movement or in the behavior in order to communicate something or to stay calm? So these are the types of questions that we want to understand. The second question there: is it possible that the child's behavior is signifying an underlying condition such as physical pain or emotional pain, emotional distress? So again, going deeper, where that's why I talk about going beyond behaviors, because we are fixated on behaviors and we need to go deeper, in my opinion, to help children feel safer. A couple of things that you can do as a parent, if you are concerned about your child's uh, ability to communicate with others. It's so important to try to support communication as soon as possible so that the child can be our guide. The teenager can be our guide. And it's critical for children, and super important for our non-speakers, those who cannot communicate through speaking or even through writing, but to get professionals on board who can help with alternative and augmentative communication and with facilitated communication, those technologies that help children and teenagers communicate their needs. And many speech and language therapists have specialized training in order to do this, and we really want to get that going um, as soon as possible. The other thing that I recommend is that there is a common reassuring adult presence with consistency across the teams. So if you have a team that has decided for whatever reason that they are going to use a reinforcement schedule and ignore certain behavior, I really want parents to know, find out what the techniques are, and find out, think about, reflect on if you feel comfortable with what is being asked of your child. There are many roads to autism support. And while I'm talking about that, I will say that the two websites, the Profectum website, and maybe we'll put that in the notes on the YouTube channel, as well as the ICDL website, both have free resources for parents and professionals to understand better this approach that is not focusing on behavior management, but is focusing on the whole child. So perhaps it's the systems and professionals who need to change their perceptions of autistic people's behaviors, and not autistic children who need to be changed so they appear more neurotypical. And again, I say that with respect, but I really believe that our culture, our systems, those things are the structures that we need to think about changing before we go in and tinker around with a child's behaviors without knowing what we are doing to the child's sense of themselves and their sense of safety and their sense of belonging and acceptance. And perhaps this will help reduce the very high rates of anxiety that we see in autistic children. My belief, and through my practice, I have seen that um, once children have less pressure on having their behaviors changed and being having joy and relational safety as the goal rather than behavior change, that their anxiety rates go down. The anxiety gets better. So that's just something, again, something to think about. As I finish, a couple of things that children need, that all of us need, but predictability, routines, attuned interactions, and staying calm through the storms that our children will go through when they are in that state of distress. We all go through states of distress. None of us can stay calm permanently. We have a nervous system. We are alive. Life is hard, and we are created. We adapt. Humans adapt by being able to do a fight or flight if we're in trouble, or if our body senses we're in trouble. And that is, I think, one of my main goals for parents and teachers to understand, is that when we ensure the child feels safe in their own way through their own individual differences, behavioral challenges fall away naturally, because the social engagement system, this ventral vagal system, as it's known in the polyvagal theory, is called the social engagement system. And when human beings feel safe through social engagement, they no longer require the behaviors that we consider maladaptive, and those stormy behaviors that we often that are very difficult to witness in our children. So in order to do that, I'll just put a plug in for self-care. If you're a provider, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, we are the raw material. Our own nervous systems really need to be gently taken care of so that we can provide that calm presence for our children, for our students. So I really believe that self-care isn't an option. It's really essential for us, because then we are going to be able to be that tool, to be that co-regulator, to be that presence that our children need. And the bottom line is that healthy relationships are not optional. They are the vehicle that drives development forward. Relationships, joy, love, hope, feeds the autonomic nervous system, and it allows children to engage in this larger and larger windows of tolerance, because I know we want our children to grow. I know we want our students to try new things and to grow their strengths. The best way to grow strengths is through having the foundation of healthy relationships. And if you're interested in learning more, I'll be sending some books over to Jen, but if you're interested in learning more, I describe in detail how we do this for each child in my book, Beyond Behaviors. It's available on Amazon at reduced rates, and other places as well. So if you read it, have any questions, let me know. I am trying to shift the paradigm to a new way of looking at things. And in that regard, stay in touch. I'm at Mona Delahooke, PhD on Facebook, and at Mona Delahooke on Twitter and Instagram. And I post, try to post things that are helpful for the community, for parents, for teachers, to help us help these children that mean so very much to us. So thank you for listening. And I think I will stop my sharing right now and bring Jen back on.
Hi, thank you so much. I definitely have questions. Well, we did get a few community questions as well. So I'll
Okay.
start with those. And if anyone else would like to ask questions now, please do. Okay, so the first question is, what are the main barriers for your approach to become a mainstream acceptable approach?
Mm. Hmm. Well, wow, that's a really that's a big question. um, that is a very big question, and this is what I have to say about that. The the developmental approaches and the it's now known as neurodevelopmental, but 25 years ago when we were all learning this, it was a more of a developmental approach. Developmental approaches were started by clinicians who studied infant mental health.
Right.
And clinicians who studied infant mental health way back when were not particularly eager or able, for whatever reason, I don't know, to do research. So the real answer to your question is that the money is going to go where the research is. So hope on the horizon. There's a lot of research going on right now that supports this approach. One example is the work of Jonathan Green in the UK. So they have an approach that it has randomized control studies, and they're going on with these different forms of research that is going to eventually take over or at least match what's there right now. I'm not a researcher myself, but you can find the critiques of the original research done at UCLA on behavior therapy, and there are quite a few critiques about that research now, but it is used as as evidence. So long answer to your question is a few things. Clinicians who know it works, but autistic advocates themselves are speaking up against behavioral techniques that harmed them.
Yeah.
This is the main push. So we need to get away from, oh, the research says this is it, and so we're going to fund this. And I call on TRICARE for our U.S. military families. No, please give families the choice. A lot of insurance companies are not giving families the choice. So the push is coming from autistic advocates themselves, telling researchers, telling insurance companies, I didn't appreciate the way I was treated. Would you like to add to that, Jen?
Yeah, I would say one of the other big things, I mean, of utmost importance to me is to listen to the autistic adults, because they're the very people who have experienced this. And, there's no other field I can think of who doesn't take into account the feedback from their patients, right? So, that's number one. I think that a lot of schools need to perhaps make it more of a practice to uh, take perspectives from the people who have been through these systems. The other thing is, kind of really taking a hard look at the so-called evidence that does exist now, that is used as a reason to fund certain things, but it doesn't necessarily hold up to the scientific rigor that we expect in most areas. So
Right.
I think that there needs to be a coming together of the autistic community who is, they're like basically begging for all of us to listen, um, as well as professionals to kind of, you know, it's like we kind of have to almost be forced to make ourselves a little uncomfortable
Mm,
so that we can speak up for what we know, because all of the information that we have available tells us that, you know, we know that compliance isn't helpful. We know that autistic people have sensory differences, including sensory gifts. Um,
yes, yes.
and that it's a different way of experiencing the world. And so we had Dr. Dora Raymaker on recently, and I thought she made such a great point because she mentioned that there's research about how doctors tend to have higher rates of depression and suicide because they're constantly having to mask their feelings with
Mm,
families.
wow.
They go through very tough situations and have to hide their emotions because they're trying to have, this professionalism. And so, like, we know that when people have to hide who they are, that it hurts them, and so autistic people would obviously experience the same feelings. And one of my questions actually to you, Mona, was, as someone with your background, um, what does it do to a person to be misunderstood for their childhood and their teen years? Like, what, from a psychologist perspective, like, what does that do to a person's emotional well-being?
Well, first I will give an answer that will calm parents and soothe parents to know that I really believe that children, that the love from their and acceptance from parents carries the day. So if your child has had certain treatments that now maybe you're questioning, just know your love for your child is solid, it's powerful, and that your child knows you love them. So having said, so that's the soothing part. But just imagine this. I work, since I'm an infant mental health specialist. I see children as young as few months to 3, and imagine that you're doing something that makes you happy, or you're doing something with your body that makes you happy, or humming something over and over again, or wanting to do a repetitive thing that makes you happy, and then someone comes and either takes it away, or asks or holds it hostage for you to do something else. I mean, it gives you a message. It gives the child a message that something that they inherently treasure is going to be out of their reach, or they have to pretend like they're not interested in it so they can get what they want. So I'm concerned about that. I think that it can give a child a message of conditional acceptance and safety. And that's what I want to change. I want the neuroception of safety. I didn't mention that in the talk, but neuroception is our human perception of threat and safety. I want children to feel so safe and accepted. And I think parents are providers, and people in my profession and others make parents so afraid of autistic behaviors, like,
Mhm.
oh no, this is a part of the diagnosis. And I really think we need to stop that, because there are so many autistic children. It's part of it appears to be a part of our human diversity. And when we scare or have a parent view something in their child as as something they need to either get rid of or be afraid of, it can impact the relationship of calmness and
Yeah.
joy that the parent has.
Yeah. I had saved a quote actually from you, and you said, much of what I do as a psychologist is undoing the distress caused to parents by the deficit medical model of the DSM. We need not fear developmental differences, but use them as a compassionate roadmap to deepen relationships, communication, and joy. And I think that's so true because, speaking from experience, it is extremely distressing to go through the diagnosis process. It's a deficit model. Every intervention is based on deficits. All of the evaluations that parents are listening to when they hear the way that their children are being described, um, it's really not healthy. It sets a, and when this will go back to perhaps neuroception and polyvagal theory, but you know, when we're stressed, we can't think clearly and we can't make good decisions and we can't support our children the way that we need to. So, you know, all of this is incredibly important to take note of because, you know, it directly impacts not only us but our children. Um, and um, one of the things I wanted to mention as well was going back to the stimming and the automatic behaviors, because we I see that we do have one question referring to that. Um, we know from research that this is adaptive and that sometimes it's not volitional and it's like a nervous system response, but it does seem to be adaptive both by firsthand account and research.
Right.
So what's your advice to parents and professionals? Because I've heard professionals say, well, we believe in singing, but it has to be at certain times or they can't do it during this time. What is your response to that?
My response to that is consider what message we're giving to the child. I mean, if we say, "Oh, that's okay. You can stim in for 10 minutes at the end of the hour," or something like that. The message is this is a behavior that you need to control, and it's not a part of who you are. It's something that we'll tolerate if that, and again hold hostage for you to do your other stuff. The message is not of acceptance. The message is of we're still it's I mean it's better it's better than just trying to eliminate behavior altogether, but I really think we need to change our language. We need to change the way we view and the way we value behavioral differences in autism, and be very careful about what we fool around with unless we know that that you know I guess there's another piece. One piece is that we do want to make sure that behaviors are not coming from physical pain. So
Right.
we really want to make sure that, or emotional pain. So if a child is having stress behaviors, for example, and they may have reflux or tummy issues or gut issues, which many of our kids do, we really want a sensitive GI doctor or pediatrician online to work on teams. You need a team to make sure the child's not in physical pain.
Right.
But if the behavior is enjoyed by the child, if the behavior is serving, as Liz Torres says, an adaptive purpose to reduce the amount of internal suffering a child might be having, then in my opinion, why not celebrate the behavior? Why not look at it and saying, wow, that's pretty cool that your body's doing that right now. And is there anything else you need from me?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and that goes into the strength-based model of, you know, look at you trying to self-regulate yourself. Like, I'm so happy for you that you're able to do this to help yourself, be regulated.
Yes. And you can say, mommy or daddy, I do this to feel more regulated, and you do this to feel more regulated. And teachers, kindergarten teachers and elementary school teachers can talk to the whole class about that and normalize it as not as
Yeah.
something that's part of a diagnosis, but that is something that's part of our ability to take care of what our body is asking us for. Um, and again, oftentimes with little children, it's not conscious, it's just happens.
Yeah. And that also goes back to what you said about kind of like the circular reasoning that happens. It's like, oh, they're doing this because the person is doing this because they're autistic, um, which really, that really is not, that's not a good reasoning. Like, the person is trying to adapt to the circumstances, that they're enduring in their body and the environment, which we all do. It's just that
All
some
do.
some people have, different, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? They may have more intense, need to do that in certain
That's right.
instances.
That's right. And our as humans, our thresholds for what we consider comfortable or uncomfortable shift. So I think that's one thing what that we need to appreciate is that sometimes in autism the state shifts, meaning our fight or flight. Sometimes that fight or flight urge happens fast because you can feel overwhelmed quickly by a
Yeah.
sensory stimulus, depending on the child. And then it's hard for caregivers. That's why I think self-care is really important, because when the child is going into like what we call the red pathway, when they go into this, if they're running away or endangering themselves or others, of course we have to take compassionate action, and quickly we have to protect
Yeah.
the child. But it's a whole mind shift on how we look at behaviors, and how we view them with compassion rather than through the lens of the DSM.
Yeah. We have a couple comments, which are really good, from Teresa saying, yes, we're hearing more and more from adult autistics about how they were injured. We have to challenge what we've been doing for the last 25 years, enforcing compliant behavior. Um, and uh, Wait, there was one other one here. I feel like this approach would also reduce the incidence of damaging restraint and seclusion.
Oh, yes, 100%. And if you're interested in that, the organization, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint,
Yes.
by Stevens, Beth Tolley, and all, it's a Facebook, and it's an organization that is going to this use neuroscience. We use seclusion and restraint on individuals who are in that bright red fight or flight zone, when what they need is, of course, to be kept safe and others, but what they need is compassionate awareness that they are feeling so under threat. So thank you for
Yeah.
that comment, whoever
Yeah.
made it. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, One person said, being severe autistic and deaf means you have cognitive impairment. This is what a director of special services always says.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. The I am I'm the the crossover with cognitive impairment and autism is based on old research. I think it's very hard to measure, and we have to always assume the child is not cognitively impaired. We have to assume that, and
Right.
then
Right.
communicate with the child. Once deaf and autistic, well, we have a lot of supports that child needs, right? We have to
Yeah.
get a lot of communication supports in there, but you never assume or think, oh, there's a good chance that there's a co-occurring cognitive delay until you get to know the child. And when you do, you know you're going to find that there's always thoughts and ideas there. So
Yeah.
yeah, we need to fight that in special ed. And I again, um, I hear statistics thrown around in IEPs about there's likely cognitive delay, but oftentimes it's put out there while you based on a standardized test the child's given, that's not curated for an autistic individual to answer. So it's
Right.
invalid. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And I also think that it is very dangerous territory because if people make those assumptions and they withhold opportunities from the person, they're actually causing more harm to the person because of their, assumptions. And so we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Oh, Jen, we really have to make sure, and we especially have to make sure for those children who don't have advocates, who have advocates who are so stretched, who are working full time, who may not understand the system as well, and who are told things about their child that may not be true. You could change the trajectory of a person's life by having a note on their ongoing um, paperwork and IEPs that that they're suspected to have low intellectual abilities, and it's just it's
Yeah.
not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say one more thing on that to Tatiana, because there's a really good article by John Hussman, and he gives a thought experiment of imagine if someone asked you your favorite color and you couldn't speak or move your eyes or point, how would you answer the question? And what if people just assumed that you didn't understand or you didn't have a favorite color? So I think that is like really helpful in imagining that, if you have movement differences, you know, you're not going to be able to answer certain questions. And that doesn't mean that you have cognitive disabilities. It means that you might have motor, uh, movement compromise.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank you. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And imagine that that locked inness of
yeah,
when you can't let people know what color what your ideas are. So never
yeah,
assume that a child doesn't have these good ideas. We have to assume that the child has ideas, and it's our responsibility to get them, to help them show us. But it's our responsibility, not theirs, because they're, like you said, when there's significant motor impairment, then even sometimes pointing is a challenge.
yeah.
But there are workarounds. There are workarounds.
Yeah. So the challenge could be uh, put back on the adults supporting the person and, finding ways that the person can answer. And that might take some, you know,
It
trial and error, but
absolutely, it can, and it can take some resources, but we have to do it. It's the risk is too great to not do it.
yeah. Okay. So there's another question. It says, what if the behavior is malicious or planned? Then is it appropriate to have a consequence?
Hmm. So great question. And then we'd go to kind of the definition of malicious or planned. So I'm curious, like what exactly what that would mean. So let's just have two different scenarios. So take sibling rivalry, for example, and let's just say that a child is sitting at the dinner table, and then a high or low frequency sound that nobody else can, except for the autistic child, can hear goes through, and all of a sudden the child goes into a complete stress response, but nobody knows underneath the tip of the iceberg, and all of a sudden there's a fight or flight and he whacks his sibling. Well, one could say that looks malicious, but was it malicious? No, it was a stress response. So I think the thing we need to ask is this a top down behavior or a body up behavior? Is this an instinctual response? In autism, oftentimes it's not malicious and it's not intentionally planned. On the other hand, if you have a child who is you know, testing out the boundaries of their life, who you may have told that they can't have another piece of dessert or cake, and um, they sneak into the kitchen and take some more cake into their room. That's not malicious, it's just breaking the rules. That doesn't mean you don't address it and have boundaries and have family expectations and rules. It doesn't mean being compassionate and being understanding of behaviors doesn't mean that you are allowing a child not to have boundaries.
Yeah.
All
Um,
children need boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The person added a little more detail, said
Oh, good.
student is riding a horse and wants to go outside. Instructor wants a task first, then go outside. Student refuses task, then spits on instructor.
Stress response. So let's think about that. Thank you for putting that in there. Okay, so uh, okay, we're working on, if you do this, then you get that. So this child loves the horseback ride, the horse, going on the horse. And so the child or teenager is told that they have to perform a certain thing. They have to do this, which often increases your stress load, right? Because then all of a sudden you're under this performance and you have the excitement of wanting to ride the horse. So then they crank it and they say, sorry, you got to do this first in order to get out to the horse. When their body may be really wanting to go into the horse, all of a sudden it goes from the ventral vagal system, which is I'm in control of my behaviors, to the sympathetic fight or flight. And spitting is a classic sympathetic fight or flight behavior. So thanks for the detail on that. I would really think about this if then. If you behave and perform for us, then you get to go ride a horse. Instead of following the state of the child, look at this child's nervous system. Do they need it? Ask them, do you need to move right now? Would you like to go ride the horse before you finish your project? What's wrong with including the child, as they do with collaborative problem solving, Ross Green CPS? Why not include the student in on the solution? So that was a great question.
Yeah,
Now, of
that's
course, I
great.
don't know because it's theoretical. I'm not there, but my guess is
I think too, Mona, that isn't this, even though, we don't want a child to spit, it's not
right,
a we're not happy about that, but
right,
it's also a form of self-advocacy to say, like, I'm not in a good place right now. This is, and like, I can't handle this right now. And so um, even if it's not like a behavior that we necessarily like, it is a message that, like, perhaps we need to pump the brakes and, like you said, realize that it's a stress response and maybe we're asking too much at that time.
yeah. And it doesn't mean that we are saying spitting is okay.
Right.
That person can obviously say what this is, spitting is not condoned in our setting here. It's not okay. But that child, what we have to assume is that that child did not want to spit. And if that child liked the person that they spit on, they probably felt ashamed afterwards once they calmed down, and embarrassed and unable to talk about it because it looked like they were doing it to get out of doing the homework. And that's the paradigm shift that we need to do, is to assume if this child had the choice to talk to us, to bargain with us, to say, oh no, I really, please, can we just ride the horse? But the child didn't. So the body got stressed. And that's
Yeah.
what we need to learn, is that we don't teach a lesson to a child who is in that red response. We like, whoa, oh buddy, that was a big ask. I can see that was a big ask right now. And your body's upset. And then let's work together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Hmm.
Um, okay. I think I have one more question. One of the biggest questions or most frequent things I encounter is parents whose child was just diagnosed. They're very afraid, as we mentioned, the trauma that the DSM, kind of creates. But these, parents, I remember it was one of the most vulnerable times of my life because I didn't know anything about autism. I had seen things that were stigmatizing, and most of what I knew was not positive, unfortunately, at that time. Um, but I remember being afraid, I don't know if I know how to parent her.
Hmm.
What if I mess up? What do I do? How do I help her? So we're gonna link in this video, because I love your article for the 10 things to ask for when your child is diagnosed. I think
Oh,
it's so
thanks.
helpful, and I share that with a lot of parents, actually.
Oh,
Um,
love it.
but what advice do you have for new parents who are in that space of being afraid and trying to figure out what's next?
Hmm. Well, um, I I,
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I want them to know that this field, like the field that I'm in, the field that we're in, of those professionals who are charged with diagnosing um, and helping children with differences, the field is in a huge shift right now. And so there's a chance that you would get somebody like me that would say, you know what, I'm going to tell you something that is kind of could potentially be really rock your world. But I'm going to tell you something else first. And that something else first is that um, you have an incredible child with some brain wiring differences. And you're going to have a great team to help you figure out how to support your child. And this is going to be something that is this is your child. This is we don't have to um, you were going to hear a lot of different opinions. Some of what you were going to hear is that this is a disorder and that it needs to be treated, and it needs to be treated with a certain protocol. And I just want parents to know that um, it's a good time. Now is a good time because we know more than ever we have autistic advocates. We have a new approach, a developmental, compassionate, loving approach that can help all students. And then you can figure out which behaviors you want to tinker with and what you just let be. So I guess what I'd say is no, there's so many choices out there. There's a lot of different opinions. Some of those opinions are going to rock your world. And I want you to know that you don't have to let them rock your world, because there are resources out there for you to hear from other parents and from autistic individuals themselves that this isn't a condition that we need to despair about
Yeah.
or have have sadness about. This is a human diverse brain, which is part of why our world is so amazing. And I guess the other thing I would say is that I've had the privilege of working with individuals whom I diagnosed when they were 2 or 3 and now are in the world, happy, loving, in different situations, connected, amazing people. So just don't get thrown by a diagnosis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
agree.
compassion for yourself, for providers, for your child. And I guess there's also one last thing I'll say, and that is that if if you have a provider that is doing an intervention or suggesting an intervention for you that goes against your instincts, your family's culture, your family's values, but especially your instincts as the parent of this child, you don't have to go along with it.
Yeah,
You just say no. You can say, I don't feel comfortable with this, and talk to the supervisor, talk to the team, and get the type of treatment that you feel best supports your child's social and emotional development. They're feeling loved, they're feeling safe, and their communication supported so they can let you know what they want.
yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. Um, I think so. I think that was the last question we had from the community. I just wanted to tell you again what a difference you've made. And like I said, I suggest your work to every person I know because it's so transformative and like this is what our kids deserve. Our kids deserve to be accepted and loved for who they are, to be understood with as much information as we have today. Um, and I'll mention that in next month we have Dr. Dora Raymaker coming back, and she's going to be talking about autistic burnout and the new research that they have on that as well. And so these things are all connected. The emotional well-being of our children, the importance of that cannot be understated. The need for attachment with our children can't be understated. There's research about this from people like Oppenheim and
Yes.
I think maybe Singletary, about the importance for caregivers to be attuned to their children's needs and to try to understand their children's perspectives. Um, and so everything that you do, Mona, is aligned with not only the neuroscience, but with best practices in all children's mental health and emotional well-being. And I just so appreciate your voice and your knowledge. And
Oh,
I'm really looking forward to being able to give some of your books away because
oh,
I think it's such a valuable resource.
oh,
And
thank you.
same with your website. We'll link to that as well. And I'm just so happy you were here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Your words are just fill my heart, and thank you so much. And you're right. It's when I realized that these standard best practices are what we demand for neurotypical children, for
Mhm.
all children. Look at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. It's what Neurons to Neighborhoods did set out as every child, and then there's an update called I think called Raising Healthy Children from a huge panel that says all children deserve to grow up in loving, supportive, compassionate relationships. And so we need to insist on that for our children who are on the spectrum. And that's pretty cool that we're making that happen. So thanks for having me. Take good care.
Yeah, thank you so much, you too. And just one last note, we have a webinar coming out next week, in the next 2 weeks, with the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network on whether virtual interactions are really accessible. We also have Dr. Christina Nicolaitis coming back on November 12th, I believe, on autistic adults and healthcare. And then we have Dr. Dora Raymaker on November 19th. So we hope that you'll all join us again soon. And thank you so much again, Dr. Delahooke.
Oh, thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you.